evening and welcome to the University of Houston and to the beautiful Moore's Opera House. It's great to have you here, and I'm so thrilled to see such a crowd here tonight. Thank you so much. I'm Andrew Davis. I am Dean of the Kathrine G. McGovern College of the Arts here at the University of Houston, and again, it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. So tonight we are here to enjoy and appreciate and pay tribute to this exquisite venue. You are sitting underneath, or we might say you are sitting literally within, the monumental artwork of one of the greatest artists of our time, Mr. Frank Stella. So exactly 20 years ago, Mr. Stella came to Houston at the invitation of the university and also at the invitation of Wilhelmina Beth Robertson, who is, of course, a member of the University of Houston's founding family. Mr. Stella came here to realize this piece, Euphonia, the three-part installation which defines our Moore's Opera House and serves as the icon of one of the best performance halls of its kind in the country, and indeed as the icon, the anchor, in one of the best public university art collections anywhere in the country. So this evening we celebrate this anniversary with Mr. Stella, with our city, and with the University of Houston community, and very importantly with many of the artists who assisted in the realization of this treasure. Many of them are here tonight. The evening will feature a panel discussion on, very appropriately, the role of art in public spaces. Joining Mr. Stella in the discussion will be three names who are very familiar to many Houstonians: Alison de Lima Greene, who will be tonight's moderator, and our panelists, Don Bacigalupi and Rick Lowe. In the way of introductions, moderator Alison de Lima Greene is the Isabel Brown Wilson Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Among her recent exhibitions for the museum are Mark Rothko, or Retrospective, and Yayoi Kusama, At the End of the Universe. And I know many of you, like me, have seen these not too long ago. Ms. Greene has served on the system-wide Art Accessions Committee here at the University of Houston, and she is currently a trustee of Gulf Coast, a journal of literature and art, which is published by the University of Houston's creative writing program in the English department. Panelists, Don Bacigalupi and Rick Lowe, each have strong ties to the University of Houston and have left impressive marks on both the national and the international art community, and they are widely recognized worldwide for it. Don Bacigalupi is an alum of the University of Houston who joins us from his current position as the founding president of the George Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in Los Angeles. Mr. Bacigalupi was director and chief curator of the University of Houston's BLAFFER Art Museum when Mr. Stella's Euphonia was commissioned and created, and he went on from that position to become the executive director and president of the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Rick Lowe is professor in the School of Art at the University of Houston and is perhaps best known as the founder of Houston's Project Row Houses, which is I do not miss the opportunity to point out, located only a little over 1 mile from where we are currently sitting. Professor Lowe was named by President Barack Obama to the National Council on the Arts in 2013, and 1 year later, he was, as we know, a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. We encourage you to refer to your programs for a little bit more in-depth information on this extraordinary panel that we've put together for you here tonight. The evening is brought to you by Public Art of the University of Houston and by the System-Wide Public Art Committee, members of which, many of the members of which are here this evening. I would like to especially acknowledge for a moment Dr. Harriet Stella, who joins us in the audience. Harriet, it's great to have you here. And then finally, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude and to give our heartiest Houston thanks to the chair, the very capable and absolutely tireless chair of tonight's event, Judy Nyquist. Judy, thank you so much. And then also, I've mentioned her before, but she deserves as many mentions as I can give her, Beth Robertson, whose inspiration really began it all, and she's also here. So over the coming months, you're going to be hearing a great deal about the public art program here at the University of Houston as we embark on a series of exciting events leading up to 2019 and the 50th anniversary of the collection. And we're proud to say that tonight is the first of these events. Please stay tuned, follow us, stay up to date on our new website and on our new social media channels. And now finally, let me get out of the way and tell you once again that I am so grateful for your presence in this beautiful space on this historic night in Houston. And I want to tell Mr. Stella especially, we live in this building, we work in this building every day, and after 20 years, we never take it for granted, and it's because of you. Thank you so much. So I give you Frank Stella, Alison de Lima Greene, Rick Lowe, and Don Bacigalupi. Enjoy the night.
So this is what we're going to do. Frank Stella and I picked out about 30 or so images, which we're going to run through. This will give you a little bit of context for Euphonia, what came before and what came after. Don is going to particularly expand upon the period when the work was commissioned and built. First-hand anecdotes, I think, are welcome. And then we'll open it up for a larger conversation amongst the four of us. This is one of my favorite pictures of Frank Stella. It was taken by his good friend, Hollis Frampton, part of his somewhat tongue-in-cheek series called The Secret World of Frank Stella, an ongoing series that went from the late 50s to the early 60s, a time when Stella was establishing himself firmly in the firmament of the New York art scene, having come there from being trained with remarkable teachers at Addison and at Princeton University. In full disclosure, my father was one of his teachers at Princeton, and that's when I met him. But it's also great to have Frank here at a university setting because he's always probing, always questioning. And in 1959, I'm going to quote back to you the statement he made: there are two problems in painting. One is to find out what painting is, and the other is to find out how to make a painting. The first is learning something, and the second is making something. So that's what we're going to be sort of watching him learn and make. And I'm going to ask Frank a few questions as we go along, starting with Palmito Ranch. This is a painting that recently entered the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts here. It's from 1961. It's from the Benjamin Moore series. And Frank, you describe this painting as a landscape, albeit abstract, but also one that pushed minimalism as far as you wanted it to go. You stated that while the painting was successful, this was for me the end of the line. You want to open that up?
Well, it didn't actually turn out to be the end of the line, as we can all see. And I didn't think much about it, but where's the line? The line is actually the space in between the bands of yellow color, but it's not really a line. But anyway, the point of this picture was that actually I think it was about really the color and the ability to make something very straightforward. You know, I'm hesitant to use the word simple, but I mean it is relatively simple and relatively repetitive. But the only thing that I can think of that sort of cheers me up is that I remember being patted on the shoulder by Bob Rauschenberg, said, "That's a pretty good painting, Frank." And I think the reason was because Palmito Ranch is from Texas, being a Civil War.
Some of you may remember Palmito Ranch was the site of the last battle of the Civil War. Frank quoted that to me, and I had to learn about the home state I'm living in. You also talked about being a colorist and often deny that role in your work. However, as Michael Alping pointed out in the Whitney retrospective that was in New York 2 years ago, that you manipulate our perception of space with color. And he wonderfully described your color surfaces as a trampoline. Do you want to talk a little bit about color and pushing the surface?
Well, I mean, the tradition of, anyway, contemporary modernism or New York school painting really always revolved around Hans Hofmann's teaching, and all of the abstract expressionists did it sort of naturally, and the second generation artists who were taught by and studied with Hans Hofmann, it was so much about push-pull that you think you'd go bananas. But that's the way people thought about the space in what was post-war painting or modern painting. And I think that it's important in a certain way, which is that it was a way of talking about the surface of a painting and making that surface move. And so rather than depicting movement or having things move across the canvas, which of course they did, it was a way of seeing them moving forward and backwards on the surface of the canvas, which is, you know, ironically, maybe ironically is not a good word, but anyway, it was really a version of illusionism. So abstract as things may be, as abstract as just marks of and smudges of paint are on a surface, they still function with a sense of depth. And it's a version trying to, I think, not directly trying, but something that you can't get away from, that there is an illusion and painting thrives on illusionism.
One of the things that happened as you moved out of the 60s and around 1970 was paintings got really big. This is Damascus Gate, also in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. And this photograph never really serves it very well. I mean, you can see it. But I love this installation view at the Whitney that gives you a sense of scale, and also the fact that it's very hard, unless you have a ginormous space like we do in our Mies van der Rohe pavilion, to see it all at once. There's a sort of pleasure in walking by this painting, taking it in, almost like it is becoming a mural. But this is a mural before a mural.
Well, you could say it's the end of easel painting because it really got pretty big.
And then to really get away from the easel, you came down to Houston at Bill Agee's invitation in 1982 to do our Grand Gala Ball. And I like the stash you're sporting here. And you filled Cullinan Hall with 3 monumental murals. And you're standing here also shown with the maquettes. And I love this installation view. We found that it was almost impossible to photograph Cullinan Hall. This is my favorite image of the ball murals, at least where you get a sense of scale. And the cone series now becomes very active because that's actually a curved wall. Did that influence your thinking?
Not really. With these pieces, they were trying to be, again, and everything ends up trying to be simple, but we were trying to make pieces that were straightforward in the sense that you could follow the outline, the pattern, and just paint it. So in the sense that anyone could paint it, as though it were something that could be done quickly and something that could be done without really worrying about it. In other words, it had a form, it had a shape, and the choices were made, but you were really basically painting by numbers, albeit on a large scale.
We did do this very quickly with the help of our brand new core fellows. It just kills me that they were painted over, and I sometimes want to chip into the wall and get back to those paintings. But then something came up that didn't happen quickly, a much more complicated sense of space that was introduced in Houston at least, with the Euphonia Commission. And this is part of the working process in the warehouse, and everyone's looking at this strange new shape that you introduced into your work in the 1990s that has its source in this.
Smoke rings. Smoke, yes. It was interesting up to a point. I mean, the forms are interesting, and the smoke ring itself actually, under the right or conditions, would break up by bifurcating. So a large smoke ring could produce a lot of small smoke rings dropping out of it. And it was an interesting way, or an interesting creation of shapes and forms. And we thought at the time that it could be fairly tricky, that we could model from it. And at that time, well, actually a lot before that, but there's always been a lot of modeling from forms and shapes and ideas. But the modeling of the particles, we were told anyway at the time to forget it. They weren't going to tell us how the particles were going to behave under the climate changes or different humidity and all of those kinds of things, which we thought would show us a different kind of form and maybe something more interesting than we had. But it still worked out pretty well.
So, do you want to tell us a little bit about this strange painting? Wonderful work on fiberglass, Severambia, that I think takes its title from a utopian island, imaginary place imagined by a writer working in France in the 17th century.
Yeah, good for him. But but the idea here was about what happens here in the building or working on architectural surfaces. But the basic issue here is surface. So you normally, or a conventional idea about painting is that you paint on a flat surface or you paint on a given surface. But everything is conditioned by the surface that you work on. And just as an example, to show you that it probably always was that way, if you're enamored of a flat surface and that's the way you make a painting, you paint on that surface. I mean, you only have to think of Lascaux, that those surfaces were very uneven. So surfaces can be complicated, and you can find them or you can make them however you want to help you express whatever it is you want to do on those surfaces. It could be make a painting or make holes in the surface. You could do a lot of things. But this was the beginning of an interest in forming the surface that you work on. And it's pretty straightforward, but it's a very normal kind of thing, expressed mathematically as a minimal surface. So if you draw an S on top, and then you have a rectangular yes, on the bottom, and you connect the two surfaces, you're going to get those compound curves, those connections. You do that with I don't know, spandex or something like that, and then you'd be, at the time, a lot of that was done with soap films too. And that was the idea, and the surface, and this was a freestanding surface that would take something that would be expressed on a flat surface and see how much it could change.
So this
it's over-explained, sorry.
This traveled to the show Don Bacigalupi put together for the BLAFFER Gallery as this building was going up. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to Don a little bit to talk about this show and then about the construction of the Moores College.
Thank you. Well, it was probably the show that I spent the least amount of time curating in my entire career, because I arrived here in 1996. The building was begun, and Beth Robertson had this extraordinary idea to commission this much larger work than the system-wide acquisition committee had ever undertaken previously. And in order to contextualize the commission and the making of this grand-scale work, we thought it would be important to document Frank's work in a larger conversation about public and monumental scale. And so we spun this exhibition up very quickly, called Stella in Studio, that looked at, actually the beginning point was the MFA gala in 1982. The end point was the forthcoming commission of Euphonia. And the two things that really motivated me absolutely passionately about this project, about the work itself, one was in my own work, in my own academic work, in my own career, I had always been interested in this intersection between music, sound, and visual art. And my dissertation is about the intersection of sound and art. The first exhibition I curated as a baby curator in San Antonio was called Synesthesia, about this use of sound in contemporary art. And so the idea of Frank's work gracing a music school and an opera house was an extraordinary kind of physicalization of that idea. The other motivating factor for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about the music in just a moment, but the other motivating factor was the idea of the educational richness of this extraordinary commission, that Frank opened the studio to young Houston artists to be participating as apprentices, as working artists in the project, and many of them are here tonight. That educational possibility for a university museum, for a commission at a university, was so rich and so opportunistic. When the exhibition opened, almost simultaneously the Frank Stella Studio in Houston opened, and we were able to connect what was being shown in the exhibition, including the maquettes and the early virtual reality images of Euphonia, with the studio itself. And so our docents, our education assistants were taking children from the exhibition to the studio. We had open days at the studio where HSPVA students came in and actually painted on very circumscribed passages. And it was an extraordinary mentor-apprenticeship relationship. And it was multi-generational, I would say, because Frank and his team was instructing the young Houston artists who created the work, and then they in turn were instructing many of the younger children who were coming to see it in action. And you've seen some images here. So that richness of the studio practice writ large and the educational possibilities of that happening in multiple generations was such a key component. And I think often, in fact today, 20 years later, looking at this great work, think about those young artists who, again, are here, who have gone on to their own careers, and the inflection point that this experience was for them, the learning that took place, the camaraderie, the communal effort in making this great work of Frank's design and creation, and then also the young children who came through and saw artists at work, creation of a great masterpiece, coming to see this work 20 years later. They're young adults now. And that generational transfer is, I think, the power of public art. It's the way in which public art resonates over time if we think about, ancient monuments and the way that they speak to us today, millennia later, and the way this work, 2 decades on, is having that relationship with Houston generations.
Well, I'd just like to say one thing about what you can see is this the shot? Yeah. It's true, we're all working on it, and but there's something about a commission and the fact that we have to finish it. But we never get a chance, whatever's happening halfway through it or during the part, it's very hard to improve it or to let it be. It's very hard to let it find a life of its own, because there in the studio, you can work on it, or it can have a life of its own. But when you have to put it up on the ceiling and make it stick, it has to be finished. You're not going to go up there and change it. For example. Yeah. And the other thing about that is that in the drawings and in the thought about it, it was very difficult, again, to transferring it and the distance from the ground to the ceiling. It seemed at the time that it was overdone, that everything was too large, because you were terribly afraid it wouldn't read in any way so far away. And it's hard to tell how that is going to turn out, because the adjustments, it's not going to be adjusted. So it's a little bit like driving off a cliff.
Well, I think you did it pretty well. We always sort of joke around here that this is your biggest smoke ring.
That's true. But this is interesting, because this part...
You can't quite see it here.
Right, but this ellipse is much more under control. compared to the things that are in the hallway, whatever those arches are.
So this wasn't your first theater. You did do The Princess of Wales, and I think Beth had actually seen that, and that inspired her to bring a similar project to Houston. And this was commissioned by David Mirvish.
Yes, for the Princess, that's the back of the Princess of Wales Theater in Toronto.
And that's a pretty big surface.
Yeah, but that's outside, and I don't know. It's, you know, I'll be honest with you, I mean, it's much more straightforward. It's basically a rectangle with some things that it, and that it's just, it's more controllable, or more, well, it's easier to control, and it's, I suppose, easier to visualize, as much as you think, you know, you can go anywhere or do anything. You're still kind of limited to the rectangle.
And then the interior?
Well, that wasn't a rectangle, but it's a
But it did give you an opportunity also to do these three-dimensional reliefs?
Yes. We cast those from basically collage pieces that we made, quite crude ones actually, but it worked way better than I thought it would.
And
Yeah, that's a collage, and you can see that it's sort of three-dimensional. It's just things put together and mostly plastic, bent and twisted plastic. But then we cast that, and it worked.
One more of your working studies. And then I love this elevator bank and the amount of trompe-l'oeil and illusion and 3D that actually occurs here.
Yeah, again, I think it always seems to work better if, as much as I like complicated surfaces, flat surfaces are very helpful.
So there were definitely new challenges in Houston that were posed that weren't just solved in Toronto.
Yes, it was a daunting project.
Did you know this Hans Hofmann before, or did you discover it after?
Well, I knew about Hoffman a lot. I knew quite a bit about Hoffman. And I had seen not this particular mural, but I'd seen other mosaic murals that he'd done. And I suppose this was in the back of my mind all the time. And this business of accepting a public art commission is always, it's always fraught with problems, one way or the other. And the way Hoffman was able to handle it, you know, was not exactly an inspiration, but it was you know, it can be done, you can do it, you can work on it. And, but you don't, the only difference is you don't get to the level that he reached. But it's still, it's encouraging.
And then about the same time in the 90s, you were trying to put together some very large outdoor projects. For example, this proposal for the Kunsthalle Dresden from 1992, which was just a couple years after the reunification of Germany, and when Dresden downtown still had a very bifurcated, you know, urban, you know, structure between the Rococo palaces, the bombed-out cathedral, and the new Soviet-era construction. Well, how did you see this functioning in that urban fabric?
Well, I didn't see it functioning. I never got to see it function.
How did you hope to insert it, shall we say, into that fabric?
And there wasn't much chance that it was ever going to happen. But you can see that it's a version of the minimal surfaces of the wall that I made, the walls, and working on surfaces, and then essentially boxing them in, having them enclose space, and make a form that's the building. I mean, it's probably not a good idea. The convention is that form follows function, and if you go against the grain and try to do it the other way, it's pretty tough.
This is a building I wish had been built. This is a proposal for the Constantine II Museum in Buenos Aires. Can you talk a little bit about this?
I could if I could see it, but I mean, it's, it's a little confusing. But there's one shape in there which is a shape that we use all the time now and have for maybe 15 years or so, a kind of a twisted hat shape, which is, I don't know, for some reason it was very attractive and lent itself to a lot of variations and a kind of complicated geometry. But we work in a lot of this project is underground. I mean, I thought it was pretty good between the forms on top and the way they went down. And it was interesting because there was a park on this plot that was by Burl Marx, famous Brazilian landscape designer, and it had been gone to pot, as they say, more or less. And so we worked on the garden, designing that, redoing that, and in trying to integrate that with the building and everything. And the Burl Marx provided a kind of focus or a kind of inspiration, because the art collection here is probably very close to the collection that the museum itself has here of avant-garde Latin American art that came from Europe. And so that was the idea with this museum.
And then you start making, of course this is a model, but objects that more and more occupy a space between architecture and sculpture.
Actually, Tony Caro called it sculptecture. But that was the pieces he made.
So this is 2005 now, a model for ship, and this with a walkway.
Yeah, you could walk through this space, and that was supposed to be David Whitney and Philip Johnson walking through the thing. But there was an idea here, which was, it's basically a box structure, but it's turning, it's always moving through space, so it's twisting at every point. I mean, so it doesn't, the grid, which seems pronounced, never actually establishes itself. It's always moving.
And then with this,
that's it falling apart.
and then this on top of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1994, you talked about how urban centers tend to overbuild, leaving no green space for pedestrians. We can't give everyone the right to use his land to choke his neighbors. We might be able to lift our buildings so that light and air can get to the ground below them. Otherwise, what is the point of cleaning up the environment? And I think what I'm seeing, not necessarily an echo statement, I don't mean that, but in your most recent, what is it, sculpture detector?
Let's forget it.
That you have pieces that are very anchored in sculpture, such as this inflated star and wooden stars installed at the Royal Academy, and then this new pavilion that you have just constructed near your studio in the Hudson Valley. And there seems to be this move in your work from what we were talking about at the beginning, looking at pictorial space, and now we are in public space. And
yeah, but the public, I'm not sure they really want it.
well,
but it's three-dimensional space, yes. And but this is basically a pavilion, or I mean, the truth is it's a folly, but there's a tradition for follies.
And Rick, this is where I'd like you to sort of start weighing in.
Yeah, I admire your paintings and have followed them, and they've been a big part of my life through my career. But I'm interested in the public art aspects of it. But before I ask you some of those questions, I have a couple of other questions I want to ask first. One, the first one is, you ever Google yourself?
Look yourself up on the internet.
On Google?
No, I don't believe Google.
You don't believe in Google?
You know, does anyone remember Barney Google? That's the
Barney?
Google I know.
Well, I mean, I ask that because, everybody has their wiki pages and all that stuff, and Google, you go and you find it. And I Googled you the other day, and your wiki page came up, and it said Frank Stella, American painter. And, and like I said, I understand and love your paintings and that whole aspect of your career, but there's this whole other stuff. And I'm curious about how that kind of framework fits you at this stage in your life, in your career, to just be Frank Stella, the American painter.
Well, I honestly think that I hinted at it when I said it's really about the surface. And whatever it is, for example, this piece here, it's carbon fiber on the top and then the white part and then the metal pieces. They're about color, they're about, for the most part, painted, or the surfaces are finished. I mean, you can still, to me, the surfaces are still painted if they're burnished. And so I think it's still working with them, and I think that the forms that I make, for better or for worse, are pictorially informed. And so they come from thinking about things in the way of painting.
Well, okay, so, I mean, you've kind of hinted to your feelings about, I'm kind of gathering a little bit your feelings about public art, the public aspects of that. But, and it does bring, it calls to be considered, like, an artist of your stature, I mean, you've made huge paintings and all, I mean, you can make sculpture and that kind of stuff. What would be in doing something public in the kind of public art realm? What would attract you to that? And why would you do it? I mean, what's in it for you? Besides frustration.
You're asking the question. And I have to admit I've thought about it. But look, I think it's natural to want to participate. I mean, as asocial as most artists may well be, and whatever feelings you have, you still want to be part of it, and you are part of it because you wouldn't be able to do it if you weren't drawing from what's there and from what's around you all the time. And, even I said, I mean, it's what I see. And so I see these things, these come from the public domain, and they're available to me, and I use them. And how I can turn them around, how they can go back into the public domain, it's not predictable. But I think that it's not really possible to make anything, and I always say for yourself, because in the end, it's not for you. I mean, it has to go on to another level. Although, to me, it's meaningless unless it gets by you or yourself.
But does it have any interest for you that it actually reached such a much broader audience? So, pieces in buildings like this, people that may not make their way into museums or galleries, and all of a sudden, they come into that foyer and they're confronted with this huge piece that it's almost not possible to see it.
But I don't know, you're not drawing me on. I mean, you're not giving me, that's true. But then for every time that people look at things, I mean, think of the number of times they ignore them. And and sometimes at their peril. I mean, and now with the phones, they may never look at anything anymore. Well, I'm not a social critic, but anyway. My favorite cartoon is still the one from in the New Yorker from about 10 years ago. I'm getting on the train. I'm on the train. I'm getting off the train.
I think there are great selfie moments here if we have to talk about cell phone. But I want to go back to a little bit about the connection to this particular commission and the idea of music and your work. Because in many ways, if you look at the iconography of Euphonia, and even the title, of course, you can't escape the connections to music and the both control and improvisation that inhabits this work. And I think going back to the studio process of working with young artists, from what I gleaned in that time and have recollected with some of the artists that are here that worked with you, there was a kind of orchestration of work that happened. So there were many individual artists with different hands and different capabilities that gravitated to different mark making, different themes within this work and really mastered them. And there was talk of an artist in the group who became expert in creating the surfaces and the textures that receive the imagery. Another that was the master at mixing your colors and making the right colors. And so this notion of the conductor, the composer, creating a magnificent work and employing or deploying the work of many experts, many individual voices, bringing them together in an orchestrated way seems to have great resonance, obviously, in this space. And that's what I love about this work. And I don't know in your practice, Frank, if you talk about that, if you talk about the balance between improvisation and control. Many have noted, obviously, in this work, the parallel lines that get twisted that may have derived from cigar smoke, but they do resemble musical scores, and they have all kinds of other allusions. I don't know how explicit that
Look,
is.
I don't know. I mean, people talk about the color in music. I mean, as you pointed out, the synesthesia. And I'd also like to, I mean, I really don't know, and I'm not that hands-on in a way, but I'd like to think that even though I don't think it's true in this project completely, but that I just wrote the score, and then in this way, it's kind of funny. I think it was kind of communal conductors. I mean, which was kind of nice. I mean, everybody helped each other out in a way, and were able to function quite well, actually, from one part of the studio to the other. I mean, there were people working at the same time all over the place. So a lot was getting done, well, simultaneously in a way. And and that doesn't happen very often.
Beautiful concept of communal conducting. I don't know that it works in music so well, but it certainly worked in the creation.
Well, a lot of times the musicians don't pay any attention to the conductor.
So were there interesting surprises that came out of that for you that maybe you wouldn't have expected?
Well, it's hard to say because I mean, the scale of it and the difficulty of the surfaces and everything was, again, so difficult that, I was just happy that it was over. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face the music again, no pun intended.
Well, also, a certain shout-out has to go out to the engineers and the people who got it up on the ceiling. And so there's...
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to have the patent on the glue that we used. I mean, it's really pretty good.
But it is, did some of this come out of your experience, being able to manage this come out of your experience of working in printmaking?
I hadn't thought of that, but actually, and we didn't say anything about it, but all of the imagery, we're talking about the smoke and this and that, and all of the imagery comes, the score is a collage, and the collage is all cut up pieces of prints, the off part of the prints that, didn't become an actual print. So it was all printed paper, and it all came from working with Ken Tyler. And so there are prints corresponding not directly to this particular piece or this collage, but there is a series of prints that relate to this.
Can you talk a little bit about what Ken Tyler's studio is like?
Pretty good. Ken was, there's a lot of things in printmaking, which is, and it's the same thing, you have to let the printers do it. So you have to make things available to the people that are working, and they have to make the print happen. They have to actually put the ink on the paper and do it, and they have to do the etching and the engraving and all of that. But then you have to supply the material, you have to engrave the right, or work on the right kind of surface. For example, we found that using magnesium was fantastic for etching. And then I thought I would use it on my paintings where it was a disaster. But anyway, there's a lot of technical stuff, as they say, that happens. But Ken, again, orchestrated it very well, but he was also super inventive. So that when we had a problem that we couldn't solve, one way or the other, sometimes he actually made new equipment. So changed the thing about the bed, changed a lot of things about the actual equipment that was doing the work.
You know, years ago, it was kind of, painters were painters, sculptors were sculptors, and never did the two ever meet, right? And they always say, he's like...
I'm not going to agree with you, but go ahead.
Okay, no,
Michelangelo's the exception.
Right. Yeah. How about fine art?
Huh?
Fine arts were defined by in the Renaissance.
Yeah, but
Painting, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but you could almost the way that you talk about sticking things up, that's a very painter's way of talking about structure and foundation. So, so my question is though, how did you root yourself in sculptural form as a painter? I mean, where did that come from? How did that ease into it? Because now
it had a base. I mean, it was really straightforward. When I finished the protractor paintings, and it was the architect Richard Meyer gave me this book of the Polish synagogues, a reconstruction of the synagogues in Poland that were built, and I had to have a knee operation or something like that, and I was working on what I had seen in the book and the ideas there, and it was a way of thinking about how forms work. And in a lot of ways, the way the buildings were built, mostly in the 18th century and some in the late 19th century, the wooden structures had a word I made up, which is kind of pointless, but interlockingness. But it's really about how the wood and things went together. And there's that sense that the forms, even abstract forms that you make, could lock themselves together in a way, and lock together and sort of weave themselves in the same time. So it's like it's though we're putting a puzzle together, but then the puzzle's in 3 dimensions. And so I began to think about that kind of thing. And when I got interested in that, I was at the point where I was going to paint it, but after I built it. So I found myself building. I convinced myself that the whole point of what I was building was not a sculpture or a structure or a relief, but I was building a painting. And then I was going to color it. So, and so that was my rationale.
It's interesting because in this work, obviously you were circumscribed by surface, and surface has always been a concern, obviously, but the surface is shaped, and yet you painted primarily flat images. Some of them have illusionistic shadows and they create the illusion of three-dimensionality. Some of them have built-up texture and they have a little bit of three-dimensionality, but you stuck pretty much in the plane, even though the plane is
well, there was, I mean, it was a collage, and basically everybody worked by the like Michelangelo, gridding the collage. And I don't know how interesting it is to you, but the depth of the collage in real life, when you'd see it or photograph it and everything, is probably, anywhere from, a 1/16 of an inch to 3/8 or something like that. But that creates a shadow, and so the distance, it had a little more depth when they put the shadows in at the larger scale. So what was an inch represented an inch in illusion was representing a foot in illusion up on the ceiling. So it wasn't quite as flat. We tried it sometimes flat, but it was awful.
You use a computer, and you've often talked about a computer as a tool, but there is a kind of virtual space in a computer. Does that interest you?
No, and there isn't a virtual space in the computer. I mean, although I don't know anything about computers. But, and I don't use a computer. Veronica and Igal, the people who work with me, do use the computer. But the computer we use almost exclusively, as far as I can tell, for modeling. We're really making a model. And what we do 9 times out of 10 is something that's not quite as good as those, if they're real or artificial flowers, doesn't really matter. But we would take that and scan it. And the scanning is important and it works in the computer. But once it's scanned and is in the computer, what you have is the form in a lot of different ways. But the real thing that you have is the geometry, which you can then use in a way that somebody would build that flower exactly like that for you in stainless steel, if you wanted it, if you could pay for it. But anyway, everybody works from the tapes of fabricators, so it was kind of inevitable. But it's still painting.
I'm just curious about, what you're most excited about now in your work.
Well, actually, we've gone back to working with the smoke, and I like the forms seem to move, and they seem more real or more tactile the way we're working on them now than they were kind of pictured in these collages and everything. So I like the physicality of it now.
When you did this Pillar Synagogues, not only were you laid up, but you just finished your big Museum of Modern Art retrospective. And you've just had a retrospective at the Whitney that traveled across America. You have an amazing show that just opened in Florida. Does having this sort of chance to look at the retrospective make you sort of think, okay, let's start afresh? Let's open up some new doors?
I don't know, you got any suggestions?
We'll just have to break your knee until you get some new ideas. But certainly, one of the things that I thought was wonderful about the Whitney show, and I haven't seen the Florida show yet, but I hear that what you've done with Florida very successfully, and also was brilliantly realized at the Whitney, was the retrospective wasn't chronological.
Yeah,
the
but
first thing you saw were the smoke, and then there were chronological moments, but it was more about the connections and a kind of simultaneity across your career.
I don't know. I mean, I like to, if you have an exhibition, I like to look at something and then look away from it at something else that's related to it, and I like to see what's happening. I mean, a kind of relationship between the things that, one thing that you're seeing and some other things that you're seeing. And of course, after a while, I mean, time intervenes, so something that you have here and something that's there, they're really different. But I'm not sure, you don't like to be a slave to chronology, I guess. But that's not so important as being a slave to a career. I mean, you're working, and it's the process of working and the process of what you think about what you're doing. And sometimes you even ask the question of why am I doing it, but not very often.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up because I was told to be mindful of the time, but I have one last great image. And Don, I think you know the names.
I do indeed. I asked for and received a list. I remember many, but not all, of the artists that worked here in Houston on this commission. And what's interesting to me is to know, again, where these lives have gone from that point forward. And many of these are very distinguished artists in this community and elsewhere. Many of them are educators, and it's a very rich moment to recognize these artists. So I'm just going to read the names, and if you're here, we acknowledge you in the dark. Martinette Borromeo, Amy Cable, Scott Calhoun, Chuck Deaton, Greg Donner, Tommy Fitzpatrick, Francesca Fuchs, Marianne Green, Gila Garamian, Susan Hedblum, Mark Hunstable, Elizabeth Jobling, Jennifer King, Chad Lukes, David Lozano, Paige Lundy, Christina Marin, Laura Medard, Susana Monteverde, Katrina Moorhead, Paula Newton, Kristen Schwartz, Joshua Roberts, Jose Solis, Jack Stenner, Brian Taylor, and Brian Sievert. Let's give them a round of applause. And the leader of the pack, the young man in the blue shirt, I think his name's something like Frank Stella. as well.
Huge thanks to the University of Houston for its amazing leadership role in the arts. We are so lucky that this school is here, that this school moves forward with the city every day and gives us a chance to celebrate Frank Stella. Thank you, University of Houston.